Right, good morning, Greg. Just back from holiday, for me at least anyway, and my goodness, the news was just a constant load of narrative, largely still led by Trump. Anyway, how are you this morning?
I'm good, Sean. I assumed all that was your fault, that you were travelling the world causing mischief. Yeah, I'm suffering from the end of man flu, but I'll struggle through.
Oh, good. It would have felled a buffalo, but you're
Exactly,
struggling manfully through.
exactly that.
There's a couple of things I'd like to talk about today, not least of which the build-up of force in Iran, not least of which control the air, etc. But the one that really gripped me whilst I was away was this whole statement about Trump and Afghanistan. This is what he had to say on the news.
We have never really asked anything of them. You know, they'll say they sent some troops to Afghanistan or this or that. And they did. They stayed a little back, a little off the front lines.
It's an absolute insult. It's an insult to 457 families who lost someone in Afghanistan. How dare he say we weren't on the front line?
That, now, you're in my generation, spent a formative part of our time at war in Afghanistan. And that, I know it shouldn't have done, that really angered me. It angered me on a load of different levels, not least of which it sort of trivialized the way that we'd been involved, the level of support we provided, and the like. But before I get on my soapbox and have a rant about this, what was your take on his comments?
Yeah, like you, I've been 8, 9 of my end years were involved in and out of Afghanistan in various roles. It was awful. That's as simple as that. It was on Fox News, so was it for internal consumption? But you can't get away with that these days. There's no secrets. And did he think it through? Was he really looking to single out some nations, or was he just caught off guard and said what he said? Who knows how his brain is operating? But it was awful. Of course, it was in the context of what was going on in Greenland. So to what extent was he trying to deflect from that? It's pretty much his tactic to just find something even worse than what he's already done to hide the fact he's done something else. So, yeah, I mean, rude is not the right word. And there are some commentators who said he was wrong and he shouldn't have said it. I mean, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. And he hasn't apologized.
So I think going back to to set some context for people, do you remember where you were on 9/11?
I do. I was on a flight.
Most people do. What were you doing?
I was on a flight coming back from Lossiemouth down to High Wycombe, looking after looking after the Combat Air Force. So when one of the stewardesses told us on the flight, I don't think she was supposed to, but anyway, she told us. And, we kind of wondered what it would be like getting into Heathrow, but got back into work as we landed to find, all hell kicking off and everyone, ready to roll.
Yeah, I mean, I was boss of one squad at the time, and we had jets all over the country. And immediately the first tower went down. You went, holy cow. Then the second one, I immediately kicked a recall, just get everybody home, because everything's changed. And I do think it sets an interesting context because it was the first time in history that Article 5 was triggered. In other words, an attack on one is an attack on all. And therefore, America made the call and the NATO rallied. I think there ended up being over 50 NATO nations plus partners that ultimately got involved. The UK piled in because ultimately, America had been attacked on its home soil. It blamed Al Qaeda. It blamed Osama bin Laden. It wanted revenge. George W. Bush and Tony Blair. Right, we've got to go in and do something about it. The UK went to the Helmand province. Like you, I spent 2 years of my life out in Afghanistan, and as a senior, going backwards and forwards to the UK, you'll constantly go back in aircraft packed full of the brave young, largely men who'd lost a limb, maybe two. You saw firsthand the devastation. And we lost, I think it was 457 in the end, soldiers there. But it wasn't about them so much. It's their families, it's the husbands, it's the fathers, it's the children. And the legacy of people who had to live without arms and legs was just awful. And it was worth remembering, this was America's war. This wasn't a UK war. We were going to support America. And when you look at the hard stats, which really angered me, you watch some of them, they talk about, well, America is several hundred million people. they suffered this many casualties. No, you've got to look at how many people you deployed and what proportion of those got killed. America deployed about 100,000 people. They lost, I think, about 2,400, so about 2.4%. The UK at the peak, we had about 10,000. We lost 457. We lost double the percentage of people that America did. The reason we did was we were in Helmand province, which was where the Taliban, the drugs and everything else were. And we were prepared to stand in line in defense of the nation. And to hear a president trivialize that, particularly a president who American call him a draft dodger. Yeah, 4 times he dodged it when he was at university, but a 5th time because of bone spurs or something. So the whole ethos around that, how you maintain people, how you get them to put their lives on the line, and then watch a president like that just dismiss it in a heartbeat. And then later, as you say, never actually apologized, simply said, oh no, they were brave soldiers. I just went, NATO deserves better than this. The American people deserve better than this. America deserves better than this. And my heart sank because it just, for me, it was a really sad episode for President Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I echo everything you say there. I mean, and there were plenty of others that piled in behind him. I mean, I think somebody from the UK picked up a phone and said, whoa, mate, you've gone too far here. You need to put out a correction. And of course, that there was a correction about, oh no, the Brits are great. You stood shoulder to shoulder. But he still didn't apologise. And he certainly didn't apologise to the families of the loved ones that have been lost, or those that are still maimed or injured. So, yeah, look, he's going to try and move on from this as if it never happened. I think it behoves veterans, yourself and myself, to not allow that to stand as it has. I'm particularly disgusted that some people in the UK have gone, oh, he said nice things about us now. We can back away. It's fine. He has still not apologised or said anything about any other nation. And if you look at some of the Baltic states and Denmark, they took even more casualties in proportion to us. And we operated with many of those in Helmand. And they were pretty tough beasts, quite frankly. So, yeah, it is awful. And I do wonder whether he's even trying to drive a wedge between the UK and the rest of NATO from Europe in the statement that he subsequently made. Because, of course, that would help his attempts to eke out Greenland. So, is he a master strategist or is he just a clumsy oaf? I'm afraid the latter is my vote.
That's one of the questions I was asking, was whether or not, why did he do it? And we've been used to a succession of leaders with gravitas, surrounded by diplomacy, that think before they say stuff, because they know that words are powerful. They leave a legacy. There's a meaning. And I think, therefore, every time these sorts of things come out, there's a natural assumption there's been a band of people thinking about it, and it is a key part of the jigsaw in the bigger puzzle. But I get more and more concerned that actually he's just making this up on the fly, and the huge damage that this does to transatlantic relations, unless genuinely, when you start to piece it all together, national security strategy, looking at less focus on China, more focus on the Western Hemisphere, Middle Earth, you guys deal with it yourself. And by the way, America's gradually exiting. What have you ever done for us? We've, that statement about, well, we'd come to Europe, say, but would they ever come to ours? And you go, well, the proof of the pudding is that we have. So he clearly has some sort of agenda here, which does feel like a stepping away from NATO. And I don't think there's any coincidence that still we don't have a defence investment plan, because you have a strategy that defines what the future is going to look like for defence, then you fund it. But it feels at the moment that their SDR, the very foundations of it, are crumbling at the moment. And therefore, why would you start with a defence investment plan?
I mean, we're definitely arguing from a point of weakness. That is not helping at all. I was kind of struck by Mark Rutte the other day, the NATO Secretary General. He's in the European Parliament, I think, saying that, you guys have got to wake up. You need America. You can't do this on your own, which, of course, was the complete opposite of how we've been beginning to think, or certainly Europe have been beginning to think over the last couple of weeks. And I'm not sure that Mark Rutte is going to convince them otherwise. I think Europe is waking up. You could argue it's too slow, but it is waking up. We're seeing an increase now in spend and activity. And I think Europe will now start to think about how it looks after itself, which means the UK has got a really important question to ask itself. Where does it see its greatest loyalty? And I think we talked about this last time. We continue to try and sit on the fence, to be the Trump whisperer, to bring him back to the table, to try and keep balance, because everything will be fine, won't it? And then he does what he does with the Chagos Islands and suddenly rips up that agreement in literally in Keir Starmer's face. And Keir Starmer then gets on his high horse and says, you've got to apologise for what you just said about Afghanistan. So we have seen a souring of this special relationship. So I think, Keir Starmer's right now in China, so he's got other problems on his plate. But, we have got some quite difficult choices to make in the UK as to where we think our friends truly are and who can we rely on. And the rules are no longer as they were.
So if you were king for the day,
Sure. Yeah.
do you play Trump long? Because there are some, if we were to suddenly put ourselves on a war footing, I'm not suggesting we would immediately, but recognise that there are massive shortfalls. The world has changed, and within 5 years, Russia would probably be ready to actually mount a significant attack and extend its influence into Europe. So do we trigger the Armageddon and actually go, right, we now need to cut spending on welfare, cut spending on NHS, and actually we've got to focus our priority? Or do you play Trump long and just go, in 2.5 years time, the world will have changed, everything will go back to normal, the dust will settle, diplomacy will reign again, and this will all have been an unfortunate blip that might have corrected us slightly? What do we do?
I thought you were going to ask me a different question there. So let me go back to me being king for a day, which of course I think about all the time. If I was the king, I would have written to him after his Afghanistan gaffe and said, these are the regiments I'm the colonel in chief of. These are the losses I took. I cannot come to your country and hold my head up high until you apologise to every single one of them. And now, of course, the king will never be that blatant. And we don't know what he actually wrote, if indeed he did write something. But he hasn't apologised. So anyway, that's what I'd do if I was really king of a day. If I was in charge, if I was prime minister, there's probably more appetite on this. Would I now seek to eke every penny out of Rachel Reeves and try and push the defence spend faster? Yes, I would. I'd be every day. I'd be coming into work saying, find me another 0.1%, find me another this, find me another that. Where can I go? What can we not do that allows us to do this? And even if it's terrible things, slow down HS2. Blimey, we've got about that. Or whatever options there are on the table, we should unearth every single one of them. We cannot carry on as if the world is normal apart from this one thing. And if we have done that, Trump can't then say, well, I'm just going to do what I like. And I think that is so critical. I think we've also got to make a choice. And now I'm a bit of a Europhile myself, so I would choose to strengthen our ties with Europe. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean rejoin the EU, although if it was me personally, I think that's the biggest mistake we've made over the last decade. But I would absolutely strengthen every single tie. There was something in the newspapers the other day, again, Telegraph, and they are constantly sniping at poor old Keir Starmer, about the French have chosen not to allow any money to come to Storm Shadow to go to Ukraine. They make the same bloody missile in France. Why is Europe going to give the UK money for UK jobs when we've bailed out of the European Defence Funds? Look, there are people here trying to drive a wedge between us and Europe, and I think that is a big mistake because America doesn't care about us. It will just use us. You only have to read the National Defence Strategy to see that. And if we try and step outside Europe, it's not interested. It doesn't want us interfering with China and the Indo-Pacific.
I think that's one of our. People can't really look backwards on this. There's been several articles that talked about some of the defence thing being an excuse to try and get back into Europe. You go, right, stop. The world has changed since we left the European Union. Whether that was the right decision, the wrong decision, we all have our own views. And I like you, I can't see the positive that came out of that. But this isn't about reversing the decision. It's about what are our best options moving forward from here? Not addressing a problem of the past, but going, are we stronger as a part of Europe or the European Union, or are we weaker? Are we more vulnerable? It doesn't mean we have to suddenly take on the euro. It doesn't mean we suddenly lose control to Europe. It doesn't mean we have to, but there it does feel that the world security environment has changed. And if China's worried the East, America and the West, we've got to look after Russia collectively. We've got to find a smarter way of doing that. And part of that is money. And that's why I asked the question, because and you look at the newspapers, we still seem to be drifting our way with politicians worrying about them, Andy Burnham standing as an MP, and how well the Labour Party is doing in reform, without going, hang on a minute, the single biggest threat to our way of life needs us to be starting spending money now, not just buying stuff, but creating in the industry that can deliver it, which can also contribute to our own defence industrial base, to actually invest in our economy. It's a driver for growth for the future. I know I'm not an economist, and therefore, but it just doesn't make sense to me why we don't light the fuse on this and get on with it.
Yeah, I think we said this earlier. If you're an engine for growth, put some petrol in the tank and put your foot down. It's a no-brainer, isn't it? And I think what people need to realise here, we can't just chuck money at this and fix it overnight. This will take years to get back up and running, to build industrial capacity, to build the resilience, to fill the gaps that we've created over the last few decades. So activity now is needed because we need to be better in a few years' time, and it will take that long. So every delay here is only pushing that to the right. And talking about a future in 2035, blimey, look what's happened in the last 2 weeks.
So I wonder whether that's a nice segue on to one of the things that the Air Force always focuses on is control of the air being the fundamental key. And it does feel that rather than being parochialism, if you were looking at the military today about the best way to defend our nation, the Royal Air Force air power is the sort of default setting in a way. It's your weapon of choice. And it's been proven the case in Iraq. We'll get on to Iran later, Afghanistan the same, all the way back to Battle of Britain and the like. So it is probably one of the most important things. I remember the quote from Montgomery that, if you lose the war in the air, you lose the war, and quickly. And therefore, I was chatting to one of my media colleagues the other day, and they said, well, we'll just spend more money, buy a few more jets. And you go, okay, society doesn't really seem to understand that if we're going to protect our island nation, if we're going to create not a golden dome or an iron dome, but actually have a credible capability to defend these island shores, you can't just nip down to Asda, buy another couple of squadrons of JSFs and pull a few people on the streets to go and man them. There is layers of this defence that have got to be there. And this takes years, possibly decades, not weeks or months. Where do we start with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways of looking at this, and I don't want to do a sort of doctrinal 101 teaching, but there are two aspects to control the air. One is your ability, obviously, to control your own air, i.e. defend yourself from attack. And then the other is to project your own combat power over the enemy's airspace in order to get them to buckle. And we've seen two aspects of this recently, so really good examples. So we've had, in terms of a protection, we've had Trump and his Golden Dome, where he thinks it's so important that he has all these bits in the right place for his long-range radars, etc., that he needs real estate to put it on. Well, of course, he had that real estate. Let's not go over that again. But that is all about America becoming effectively watertight. Now, you could argue it's Reagan Star Wars on steroids. And I think even Trump said the other day that, it is exactly the same as that, but now we've got the technology. Now we can do it. And I think there's some truth in that. It's hard to work out what comes out of his mouth is actually true, but the technology now can match to some degree the capability. Now, if you can completely secure your country from attack from anything, boy, how powerful does that make you? And of course, Russia and China will be fearful of that. So that's the defensive mechanism. And we don't have that in the UK. In fact, we have a few sites in the UK that help America, but they don't do an awful lot for us other than just say brace. So there's that. There's then the ability to project air power. Now, we saw it in Iran with Israel in the 10-day, 12-day war. I forget how many days it was, where America and Israel literally tore Israel apart and could operate at will in order to take out the nuclear sites. And we've seen it in Venezuela, where they can literally nip in, pick up a president, pull him out, literally in overnight. And how many casualties in those two operations? How many deaths? None. Zero. That is unheard of. Now, that's extremely attractive to a politician because, A, you mean I can just flick a switch and in 24 hours I achieve my aim? Yes, you can, Prime Minister present. Wow. And there are no casualties for me to have to announce on the news the following day and cause all sorts of grief politically. Yep, we can almost guarantee. Wow. Well, I mean, that almost makes you immune to almost anything. So, yeah, control of the air in its extreme form effectively allows you to do what you like. Now, we are seeing Trump beginning to do what he likes. So it's not all good. But I think, wait and see how Iran plays out in the next few days and weeks as to whether whatever aim he's trying to achieve there, whether he can actually do it through air power alone and what that means. But that's, we'll maybe talk about that in a sec.
Yeah, but following that theme, I think there is I read a piece this week that talked about these major powers now. When you talk about China, America, where does that leave the middle powers? And they said if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And it does feel like that if you can, as you say, strike with impunity, you don't have any cards. None of your victims have any cards to play in using that parlance. And I think, ballistic missile threats, we have no defense in this country against them. America has some, but hasn't got the sort of golden dome yet. And it's a really tricky nut to crack, isn't it? I mean, it's a hypersonic missiles. It's striking a bullet with a bullet that's going 3 times as fast as the bullet normally goes. Yeah. You cruise missiles, we can fight those with fighter jets and the like. So we've got a bit more protection against that. But as you say, part of its detection, we've got Findales. Great. As you say, a little bit of a warning before we die. That's nice to know. Yeah. And the fighters, we just don't have anything like the numbers today. And I don't know whether this will end up, not for today, but with a discussion about, do you end up having quantity or quality? Do you end up having the sort of strike master type capability to augment your high-end fighter jets? We were in Afghanistan, we started off, we were operating a lot of very high-end jets to do a relatively simple job that potentially the old strike master used to be able to do. Is there an opportunity here to have quantity as well as quality? I think, it's something that Ukraine is certainly valuing the F-16s, but largely just shooting drones out of the sky. So I do think there's the layers, and I don't even know where you start that conversation when you're no longer a major power. What's the threat? Is the threat actually America? Is the threat China? And therefore, how on earth do you configure our forces nationally as well as internationally to provide a credible deterrent?
I think, you raise the really critical issues here. So in the past, the UK has viewed itself as relatively safe under a US umbrella. So in terms of its own protection, it's sort of going to rely on Big Brother to do a little bit of that for us. Now, whether that would have happened or not is another matter entirely, and we certainly don't know now. And therefore, what we actually did is we became a mini-me, a little mini America. And the Navy, to a degree, did this, and you could even argue the Army has also done it. And all we looked at is how could we fit 10% effort into a US-led operation for which we wouldn't embarrass ourselves. So we played at the top end so America could just slot us in on day one. And that was our focus. That was our doctrine. And that's the forces that we have today. The problem is if you keep doing that, obviously you pay for quality, not quantity. So that slightly ties you off. It also suggests you're always going to go to war with America and you're always going to fight America's foes. Now that we're seeing such a stark sort of divergence of that, the question for us and Europe is Russia the threat that we should focus on? Because if Russia's the threat we focus on, then the UK and Europe today outmatch Russia in many respects. We need more resilience. We need more air defense. There's lots of things we need to take care of. But if you only focused on that threat, you would come up with a slightly different approach to force structure. If we still think we're going to go to war with China on America's shoulder, then we'll continue to buy equipment and capability that is capable of doing that. And that will be overkill in a Russian-European scenario. So I think we've got some so a lot of people have said, the SDR hasn't changed. The assumptions haven't changed because everything's exactly as it was when it was written. Bullshit. It has fundamentally changed. Now, you might choose to ignore that and think it'll go away. And yeah, we can all sit here with our fingers crossed and hope that, Trump changes his mind, moves on, and somebody else comes in and is much more sensible. That's a pretty brave decision to make. with 3 years to go. So, yeah, I think we've got some quite serious questions to ask ourselves. Do we focus on European effort against Russia, which would drive us down some slightly different routes? Or do we continue to try and sit alongside and be a day one entry with America at a certain level of effort, which is how we've always been in the past?
The other sort of final bit of that area would be, I know we're both air power sort of experts. We've got lots of experience in that. But I don't know about you, but I spent most of my time on operations on the land or at sea rather than in the air. But I still see that whilst my land colleagues for many years said, you can only actually truly put with boots on the ground, you can actually have influence. Air is very temporary. I get that. But if the world is moving less into taking territory and more into just schwacking people or acting as a deterrent, particularly with the UK's position well away from Russia, would we really want to be investing in large land footprints, a big army that we have to move around? Or would our contribution to that defence be much more air and maritime focused? We've traditionally been a maritime nation, 90+% of goods moved by the sea, freedom of passage of the sea is really important to us. And therefore, it feels inexorably the shift is going towards less about parochial air, land and maritime and more to do what's the SDR? What do we actually need to do? What's the primary threat? And then configure ourselves accordingly and respect the fact that we may have a part to play in a broader game. And that may be a very differently configured force. And for me, that's the real question is, if you're going to do it nationally, you'd probably want to have a bigger army. If you're going to be part of an international force, do you want to be just very good at a couple of things that can contribute battle winning capability?
Yeah, and I think NATO at the end of the day is a defensive alliance. Some may argue against that, but that's its fundamental raison d'etre. And we defend NATO by having a strong land force, ideally, to deter Russia crossing a boundary. But we take the fight to them through air and maritime and space, and where offence is the best form of defence. And I think that's something we all need to be a little bit more zeroed in. We've got used to using armies to go to operations, expeditionary operations overseas, and middle power versus middle power or slightly below middle power. And okay, some of that may still be required. But if we're just focusing on NATO first and Russia, I think we are using armies to hold the line. We're using air and space power to put the enemy on the back foot and make them realise that they can't win. Which is what Ukraine has struggled to do.
No, I agree. And I was going to use that as an example because, this is not trying to be parochial at all, but it's if you allow yourself to get drawn into a land battle, it's going to be attritional if you're going to be fighting anybody like Russia because they don't care. They don't care about the numbers. We do. If we lost 1,000, 10,000, 50,000 soldiers, that would be massive. Whereas having air power, naval power, and can strike with impunity, that is the way that we need to be fighting. But we need to have the decent stockpiles to do that. We need to have the weapons to be able to do that. And we need to have the teamwork, command and control and space capability.
Putin would happily drag us into an attritional war. That's exactly where he'd want us.
Exactly. So we've got to make sure we don't.
Exactly.
So then that leads me lovely on to the sort of the question at the moment. As we speak, there are massive build-up of forces, naval and air forces heading towards the Middle East. Lots of talk about Iran, lots of talk about American movements through British dependency, Lake and Heath, Diego Garcia, and potentially, I think, what is the count of the Abraham Lincoln is being diverted down.
Yeah.
What's going to happen? What is this all about?
Well, firstly, this has taken a long time, hasn't it? We had Trump talking quite bravely a few weeks ago about how the Iranians should stand up, take control of their organizations. And it reminded me of George Bush Sr. doing something very similar after the first Gulf War. And whilst we stopped in Kuwait, he said, rise up, Iraqis, and overthrow Saddam Hussein. And then you and I spent years watching them getting killed in Southern and Northern Watch because we didn't give them any support. And there's a danger that we've done exactly the same in Iran. We've given them a little bit of a, shall we say, a pep talk and a bit of confidence that we're only just over the horizon. And we've been diverted by a globalist conference in Davos nicking Greenland off each other, shutting down agreements on the Chagos Islands, and slagging off each other about war death. So Iran would have said, blimey, we can't believe our luck here. America's got distracted. Now America's back on the agenda. Well, there are tens of thousands of people who've been killed in Iran in that period. So there's a question there about, has the regime regained control? It does appear as though it may have done. And therefore, what is Trump now trying to do? Does he think that by rattling his saber and throwing a few bits of kit, by the way, that normally would have been there anyway? So the fact that there's no carrier strike group in that region until now is almost unheard of. In fact, the Lincoln that they've put in there has come from the Indo-Pacific. So they've had to rob the one platform they've got there to do the Middle East, partly because they've been diverted over to Venezuela. So America is running out of capacity here to do all foreign policies at once. Trump cannot spin every plate simultaneously, and he's going to wear his military out. So is he going to do something? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. Of course, that may be his whole gambit, is he wants to stay ambiguous. But if he is going to do something, what is he going to do? Because he's either trying to get the regime to just go, oh yeah, all right, fair enough, that we've crossed the line, we'll toe the line back. Or is he trying to regime change? So we've got Ayatollahs holed up in bunkers somewhere waiting to get schwacked. That's tough to do. Regimes like Iran don't like the idea of regime change. And if you think they're fighting dirty now, wait and see when they're really, really under threat.
Well, that's the thing is, though, what are the options? I mean, America is militarily massively dominant. It could virtually do what it wanted to do. Just the Abraham Lincoln, his 90 aircraft can operate from the decks there, and you and I would be envious of the F-18s, the F-35Cs, the Cats and Traps version, the Growlers, the Hawkeyes, the like. It's a very impressive air power capability. But I don't see any American appetite to put boots on the ground into Iran. That could end very, very badly. So what do you do with air power? It's nice to be able to strike the nuclear facilities, and question still arises, is that simply a temporary blip, puts them back a few weeks, a few months, maybe a couple of years? But what do you do with air power otherwise? I mean, I'm just not entirely clear. You can threaten all you like, you can beat your chest, but what are your options on the table?
Well, you probably take a leaf out of the Israeli book and you begin to decapitate. You target in key individuals. Now, are they just going to be replaced by somebody else? Probably. So the idea that you can somehow surgically remove the regime by a few well-placed bombs is tough to do. And I'm not sure, yes, he did it in Venezuela by lifting the guy literally in a helicopter. Okay, that's pretty brave. In Iran, I don't think you expect the same level of success. So, yeah, it is really hard to see here what they can achieve. Trump will not want many casualties. If Trump gets casualties, he's in trouble because, his big sell was on not starting new wars, ending all the other wars. Now, if he could suddenly bring Iran back to, a peaceful democratic nation, yeah, okay, maybe he does deserve a peace prize. But that's not easy to do. We've agonized over Iran. The only positive here is the 10-day war of last year has demonstrated that Iran is weaker than we thought. The idea that it would respond in any meaningful way or be able to retaliate or be able to defend against those attacks have been totally misproven. And I very much doubt Iran has improved since then. So Iran should know it's weak. It hasn't got Big Brother anymore because Russia probably hasn't got the capacity to help it in the same way that it might have done previously. So, it's not all great for Iran here. But the question for me is, why did Trump wait 2 weeks? I mean, he had the bit by the teeth a while back. The revolution, if you want to call it that, was at its peak, and we've now just backed off for 2 weeks, and off the ball a bit.
I also wonder whether part of the answer to that may be that if you were the Iranian leadership, you'd have to go, right, we were completely laid bare. We had Israeli F-35s flying with impunity over Tehran. We have to find a way to deter, if it's not nuclear weapons. And I was looking at their sort of long-range missiles. They have short-range ballistic missiles, up to 1,000 kilometers. I think they're medium range up to 3,000 kilometers. None of which could strike America. They could strike American bases in the region, and they've been threatening World War III if an attack. But there's some claims that they actually have a 10,000 kilometer intercontinental ballistic missile, and that would put United States in range.
Yeah.
Now, whether it's today, tomorrow, next month, next year, next decade, these things that gradually proliferate, Russia is going to be more inclined to help Iran if that undermines America. China's going to be more inclined to help Iran if it undermines America. And therefore, once they get those sort of long-range missiles, they may not have to be able to withstand the attack from America. But just imagine a missile landing in the middle of Washington.
Yeah.
I mean, you talked about casualties. Trump, a couple of military casualties would pale into insignificance if Iran was able to kill a load of Americans and do it on the back of saying, look, we were a peace-loving nation. You were the guys who started this. We were obliged to stop it. That's my worry here.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll say, and if the Ayatollah is listening, if they did do that, look out. America would absolutely throw the kitchen sink at them. So, there are things that you can't do to America and get away with it. So, Iran, it'll be interesting to see how they play the game. I've played Iran in a number of classified war games, so I'm not going to give anything away on here. But so I know how this can play out, and I know what Iran's capabilities in terms of what it is capable of doing. I think what's going to be fascinating now is how the Middle East plays this, because we are seeing countries in the Middle East trying to calm things down. We know there are countries that are sympathetic to Iran, Oman, Qatar, too, certainly. And we know that Trump is pretty thick with them. So they will be doing everything they can to influence America's position here. And you could argue that the American military footprint in the region now is what it was 2 years ago. I mean, that was normal. So the idea that we've suddenly ratcheted it up to something new, well, actually, no, we've put it back to normal. And even one carrier strike group isn't enough to sustain operations over Iran for months on end. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. We've obviously got the UK have deployed Typhoons to Qatar. And for those that don't know, we operate a joint UK Qatari squadron, 12 squadron it is. And I wouldn't be, I didn't see which one went, but I'd be amazed if it's not 12 squadron. To act as a defensive shield on behalf of Qatar in case things do kick off. And of course, there was all that fuss made last time, and there was assumptions that we'd refueled Israeli airplanes and all that nonsense. I think we will be looking to stand shoulder to shoulder with an ally that we've got, some serious industrial links with over Typhoon. So there's a lot going on right now.
But even if you take the one other bit of this, which you and I serve the military, but the military, we've said before, is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And the worry is that when we went in and took out Saddam Hussein, we basically took the lid off the pressure cooker, and the thing goes absolutely nuts. We may not like the way that some of these dictators or whatever do the job, but they do keep a lid on a pressure cooker. And putting a McDonald's on every street corner, giving women the vote, doesn't necessarily make it a democracy. And my worry is, when you've got someone like Iran, it's very easy to say, right, we'll take out the Ayatollah. But the so what is, okay, what are you going to do with the ensuing mess, the carnage that then erupts? You've got to have a different model. There has to be a political solution that can help create the end state you want, not just take out an individual.
Yeah, I'm not a very close observer of Iran in terms of that. But, my sense is that there is a real pent-up frustration in the country that if you gave it some sort of freedom to operate. And I think that maybe that's an answer. Could US air power, probably a bit of Israeli as well, allow that revolution to flourish? Could you effectively act as its air force? And where there are demonstrations, where there are interceptions, US air power turns up and gives the demonstrators the edge. That's incredibly difficult to do. If it was your own side, to coordinate that level of operational sort of fidelity from afar would be extremely difficult. So yeah, but it's one model that perhaps you could see that you give the revolution control of the air, which then allows them to prosecute the revolution. So yeah.
Like, and sort of my final thought on this is you go full circle that we talk about Iran being weaker than we thought it was. I wonder whether Russia is looking at us and thinking exactly the same thing. You know, we were configured for wars of choice, so going around the world, transporting lots of people. If you look at defense of our island nation, we've got some very, very impressive capability. But if you look at it through a war game endurance attack model, I think Russia would be seeing a lot of cracks around us.
Yeah, I'm slightly more optimistic than that. I still believe that the quality that we have, and not just in the platforms and the weapon systems, but in the training, that I think we've got the edge. Now, whether we've got enough resilience in the tank to sustain that for long periods is a different matter entirely. But I think on one, there is no contest. And I think Russia has always feared NATO air power, and nothing has changed to make them change their view. And yet everything has made us change our view of any respect for Russian air power based on the last 4 years in Ukraine.
So on that, Russia will be investing heavily in that. At the moment, we're not. And from the Cold War, when you and I saw that every day, whether it was defensive aids, whether it was electronic warfare, you had to be plugged in, you had to be part of that race, otherwise you lost.
Yeah.
We have not been part of that race for several decades now. Russia is now started that. It's got its defense industrial base spun up. We may have an advantage, but we're kidding ourselves if we think that's going to last for very long unless we start to engage.
Yeah, that's fair. We've definitely went into a holding pattern for a long period of time. My belief is, and it comes back to that point I made about us, our previous doctrine, because we've always tried to retain a capability to be day one capable with America. We have actually focused on that top end. We've just got very little of it. So the question is, how do you scale it up? You know, we've got good tacticians. We've got good electronic warfare skills. We're building decent weapons and decent weapon systems. Now we need enough of them to genuinely make the difference. It's not just about defending. It is about taking it to the enemy. That's the key.
One to follow next week.